The sun over Redemption Creek did not shine so much as it oppressed a heavy, unblinking eye of white fire that bleached the color from the wood of the storefronts and boiled the moisture from the very air until every breath tasted of copper and ancient dust. A relentless heat that settled into the marrow of the town and turned men, as thoughts toward violence as surely as vinegar turns to mother. It was high noon, that suspended moment when shadows hide beneath the soles of boots, terrified to expose themselves to the glare, and the silence that draped over the main thoroughfare was not the peace of idleness, but the suffocating stillness of a held breath. For the black carriage had arrived, its iron-rimmed wheels grinding against the hard-packed earth with a sound like bones snapping under a heavy boot. A carriage that seemed to absorb the light around it, drawn by 4 horses the color of midnight, whose coats foamed with lathery sweat, and whose eyes rolled wild and white in their sockets. Beasts that smelled of sulfur and bad road. Redemption Creek was a town built on the promise of silver that had never materialized, leaving behind only a husk of desperation and a saloon that watered its whiskey. But today the desperation had curdled into a cold, paralyzing terror because Judge Silas Vane, the hanging judge, had come to hold court. And when Silas Vane held court, the verdict was written in the ink of the grave long before the gavel ever struck wood. The carriage door opened with a groan of dry hinges, a sound that echoed off the false front buildings like a gunshot. And out stepped the man himself, a towering figure draped in a long duster of black oilskin that seemed impervious to the heat, his face a landscape of crags and fissures hewn from granite, with eyes that possessed the flat, dead sheen of a river stone viewed through murky water, eyes that had looked upon 1,000 condemned souls and found them all wanting. He did not step down so much as he descended, his boots hitting the dirt with a heavy, authoritative thud that sent a tremor. Through the wooden boardwalk where the sheriff stood a man named Miller, whose badge felt suddenly heavy and cold against his chest, a tin star that offered no protection against the force of nature now walking toward him. Beside the carriage, shackled hand and foot, was the boy Caleb Thorne, a creature of hardly 20 years, whose face was a mask of dirt and tear tracks, his lips split and bleeding, his ribs heaving against a shirt that was more whole than fabric, dragged there by the judge's marshal's men with faces hidden beneath low brimmed hats and hands that rested comfortably on the pearl handles of coat peacemakers. The crime was theft, a horse stolen from the wrong ranch, a desperate act by a desperate boy trying to outrun a famine that had taken his family. But in the logic of the West, and specifically in the gospel according to Judge Vane, motor was a luxury for the afterlife, for here there was only the law, and the law was a steel trap that, once sprung, cared nothing for the softness of the flesh caught within its teeth. The town had gathered, a semicircle of silent witnesses, women clutching their shawls despite the heat, men chewing on tobacco they had forgotten to spit, their eyes darting from the judge to the boy to the great oak tree that stood at the end of the street, a tree whose lower branches had been sawed away years ago to accommodate the darker purposes of justice, its bark scarred by ropes of the past, a gallows grown from the earth itself. Judge Vane did not ask for a courtroom. The street was his venue, the dust his floor, and the sun his witness, and he moved with a terrifying economy of motion, signaling his men to drag a heavy wooden crate from the back of the carriage, which they set upright in the dirt to serve as his podium, placing upon it a thick, leather-bound Bible that looked as if it had survived the fire, its cover warped and blackened. Vane placed a hand on the book, his fingers long and pale, like the roots of a plant that grows in the dark, and looked out at the crowd, his voice rising not as a shout, but as a low rumble that vibrated in the chests of those who heard it, a voice of gravel and old iron. "We are born in sin," Vane began, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, stopping on Sheriff Miller, shrinking him, stripping him of authority. "And we spend our days begging for a mercy we do not deserve. But the law is not merciful, for the law is the fence that keeps the wolves at bay. And when the fence is breached, when the sanctity of property is violated, the fracture must be mended with blood." Caleb Thorne began to weep then, a high, thin sound that cut through the judge's sermon, a sound of pure distilled terror that made the stomach turn, begging for his mother, begging for God, begging for the sheriff to do something. But Miller stood frozen, his hand twitching near his gun, but never drawing it, paralyzed by the sheer weight of Vane's presence. by the knowledge that interfering would mean his own end, for Vane carried the authority of the territory and a reputation that suggested he might be something more or less than human. The marshals moved with practiced efficiency, throwing a rope over the stoutest branch of the oak, the hemp hissing as it slid over the bark, the noose, dangling, swaying gently in the hot breeze, a dark halo waiting for an occupant. There was no trial in the traditional sense, no jury of peers, only the accusation leveled by the judge, the evidence of the horse found in Caleb's possession, and the swift, brutal calculation of the sentence. Vane did not look at the boy, did not acknowledge his humanity, seeing him only as a malignancy to be excised, a broken cog in the great machine of order. Caleb Thorne, Vane intoned, opening the black Bible but not reading from it, as if the words were merely a prop for his own scripture. You have taken what is not yours, you have broken the covenant of honest men, and for this fracture you shall hang by the neck until you are dead. May the Lord have mercy on your soul, for I shall have none. The finality of the words seemed to suck the air out of the street, the silence stretching so thin it threatened to snap, broken only by the boys' incoherent pleading as the marshals grabbed him, hauling him up not to a platform, for there was none, but onto the back of his own stolen horse, which had been brought forward, a cruel irony that Vane seemed to relish. They bound his hands behind his back with rough twine that bit into the skin, the sheriff watching the blood trickle down the boy's wrist, feeling the bile rise in his throat, a sickness born of cowardice and helplessness. The noose was lowered, scratching against Caleb's cheek before settling around his neck, the coarse fibers rushing against the tender skin of his throat, the knot positioned behind his left ear with surgical precision. The horse, sensing the tension, skittered sideways, and Caleb screamed a raw, primal sound that echoed off the canyon walls, a sound that would haunt the dreams of every man, woman, and child in Redemption Creek for a generation. Judge Vane watched, his face impassive, a mask of stone, and then, with a nod that was almost imperceptible, he signaled the fracture, the moment where the world broke. A marshal slapped the horse's flank hard with his hat. The beast reared and bolted, its hooves kicking up a storm of dust, and Caleb was left suspended in the air. There was a sickening crack loud as a pistol shot the sound of the cervical vertebrae, shattering under the weight of the body, a sound that signaled the end of the boy and the beginning of the legend. For he did not die instantly, but danced the macabre jig of the hanged his boots, kicking at the empty air, searching for purchase that wasn't there, his face turning a mottled purple, eyes bulging as if trying to escape his skull. The town watched in horror, unable to look away, bound by the spectacle of death, while Judge Vane calmly picked up his Bible, dusted it off, and turned back to his carriage, leaving the boys swaying in the heat, a pendulum marking the passage of time in a town that just lost its soul. As the carriage rolled away, the wheels grinding once more against the earth, the sheriff finally fell to his knees in the dust, the fracture complete not just in the boy's neck, but in the spirit of redemption. Creek, which knew now that judgment had come, and it wore a long black coat. The silence that followed the initial confrontation was not the peace of a church, but the vacuum of a tomb, a hollow and ringing emptiness where the echo of the retreating boots of the lawmen, men who had sworn oaths upon Bibles bound in cracked leather, struck louder against a hard-packed earth than any gunshot ever could, creating a dissonance in the sweltering air that signaled the death of order long before the first drop of blood hit the dust. Elias Thorne, a man who had hitherto believed in the sanctity of the gavel and the righteous weight of the statute book, stood alone in the center of the thoroughfare, his shadow puddling beneath him like a stain of dark ink, watching the backs of his deputies recede into the dim safety of the livery stable and the saloon, their spines curved in the shame of survival, leaving him to face the 5 riders of the Blackwater gang who sat atop their horses like vultures perched on a fence rail, motionless and patient in the shimmering heat. The town of Redemption Creek did not scream, nor did it flee. It simply closed its eyes, the shutters of the mercantile slamming shut with the finality of a coffin lid, the heavy oak door of the bank groaning into its frame, and the iron bolt sliding home with a metallic rasp that tore through Elias's heart more violently than the bullet he knew was coming, for it was the sound of a community severing a limb to save the body, a cold and calculated amputation of their own conscience. The heat seemed to intensify, the sun pressing down with a physical weight that made the horizon dance and blur, turning the riders into faceless specters of judgment, and Elias felt the sweat trickle down his spine, cold and clammy, despite the furnace of the day, realizing with a clarity that was both crystalline and agonizing that he was not merely outnumbered, but utterly discarded, left as an offering to the wolves by the very sheep he had spent a lifetime shearing and protecting. He looked toward the window of the boarding house, where he knew the mayor watched from behind lace curtains yellowed by tobacco smoke. But there was no movement, only the blank stare of glass reflecting the unforgiving sky. And in that reflection, Elias saw the truth of the West, that civilization was a thin coat of paint over rotting wood, and he was the nail that had been hammered down too hard, now left exposed to the rust. The leader of the riders, a man whose face was a topography of scars and bad intentions, spat a stream of brown tobacco juice into the dust near Elias's boot, a gesture of disrespect so casual it stung worse than a slap, and slowly, agonizingly drew a long-barreled Colt from its holster, the metal gleaming with a sinister blue sheen, the oil on the cylinder catching the light like a dark promise. Elias's hand hovered over his own weapon, an old Navy revolver that felt suddenly heavy and archaic, a relic of a time when honor dictated the outcome of a duel. But there was no honor here, only the mathematics of cruelty, for as he drew, a shot rang out not from the rider in front of him, but from the rooftop of the general store, a coward's perch, shattering Elias's right shoulder in a spray of red mist and white bone splinter, spinning him around like a dancer who had lost the music, his pistol falling into the dirt with a thud that sounded like the end of the world. He hit the ground hard, the breath driven from his lungs, the taste of copper and grit filling his mouth, and as he lay there gasping, like a landed fish, the world tilted sideways, the blue sky turning gray at the edges, and he waited for the finishing, shot the mercy kill that would send him to whatever judgment awaited, but it did not come. Instead, there was the creak of saddle leather, and the soft thud of boots landing on the earth, and then the crushing weight of a boot heel grinding into his shattered shoulder, eliciting a scream that ripped from his throat and echoed off the shuttered facades of the silent town, a raw and animalistic sound that should have summoned angels or demons, or at least a single Christian soul with a shotgun, but summoned nothing but the dry wind. They did not kill him then. Death would have been too simple, too clean for the lesson they intended to carve into the history at the creek. They stripped him of his coat, his badge which the leader tossed into a horse trough with a laugh that sounded like gravel grinding together. And then they tied his ankles with rough hemp rope to the saddle horn of a roan Mari that smelled of sweat and old blood. The dragging began not as a sprint, but as a slow, deliberate procession, a funeral march for a living man, the horse walking at a measured pace down the main street while Elias plowed the earth with his own body, the rocks and ruts tearing at his clothes and skin, flaying him inch by inch, the friction burning like fire, his head bouncing against the hard pan with sickening thuds that flashed white lights behind his eyelids. He saw the town from a new perspective, from the vantage of the worm and the snake watching the underside of the boardwalks where the rats scurried, seeing the dust motes dancing in the shafts of light beneath the doors that remained barred against him, and in every crack and crevice of the wood he saw the complicity of silence. They dragged him past the church, where the cross stood stark against the sun, and Elias prayed, not for salvation, but for wrath, his prayers turning from pleas of mercy to darker, ancient invocations, begging the earth to swallow them all. But the earth remained solid and indifferent, drinking his blood with a thirst that had been parched for centuries. They dragged him out beyond the town limits, past the last shanty and the rusted remains of a failed mine, out into the scrublands where the sagebrush clawed at his passing form, and the cacti stood like silent sentinels of the wasteland. The pain became a universe unto itself, a blinding white-hot existence, where there was no past and no future, only the agony of the now, the tearing of flesh and the grinding of bone, until finally near the dry bed of the creek that gave the town its ironic name, the horse stopped. The rope was cut, not untied, and Elias was left lying in the alkaloid dust, a broken heap of raw meat and rags, the sun beating down on his exposed wounds, baking the blood into a hard black crust. The riders circled him once, their laughter drifting away on the wind, and then they rode off, leaving him to the coyotes and the buzzards. abandoning him to the slow, agonizing death of exposure. But as the sun began its descent, painting the sky in bruises of purple and red, Elias did not die. He lay there unable to move, listening to the silence of the desert, which was louder than the noise of the town. And in that silence, something within him fractured and reformed. The man who had been Elias Thorne, the man who believed in law and community, died in that creek bed, his soul leaking out into the sand. And in the husk that remained, something else began to take root, a cold, hard seed of vengeance that fed on the pain, drawing strength from the betrayal, calcifying his heart into a stone that could no longer feel warmth or pity. He watched the first star appear a cold, unblinking eye, and he made a vow to the darkness that was encroaching the covenant, not with God, but with the abyss that had stared back at him from the windows of Redemption Creek, that he would return not as a man, but as the judgment they had so feared a reckoning that would not need a badge or a gavel, for he was now the law of the Lethe, wasteland forged in abandonment and tempered in blood. The earth beneath Elias Thorne's cheek was not merely a passive surface upon which he lay broken, but a hostile and living entity, radiating a stored malice gathered from 1,000 noons of unbridled solar fury, baking the skin of his face with the intimacy of a lover scorned, while the grit sharp as pulverized glass embedded itself into the open abrasions of his jawline, forcing him to taste the geological history of Redemption Creek, a flavor of alkali dried excrement, and the coppery tang of his own life leaking steadily from the jagged ruin of his side where the outlaw's lead had found a home. Time, which had stretched and warped during the betrayal, now solidified into a heavy, viscous substance that made every heartbeat feel like the tolling of a great and terrible bell, counting down not to rescue, but to the final suffocating embrace of the void. And as he lay there, pinned by the gravity of his own failure, the silence of the town pressed down upon him, a silence more violent than the gunshot, because it was the silence of complicity, the hushed breath of 100 souls behind shuttered windows who had watched the law fall and had chosen the safety of shadows over the dangerous light of intervention. Elias tried to draw a breath, a simple act that had sustained him for 40 years without thought, but now it required a negotiation with agony so profound it whitened his vision, the air rattling through the fluid in his lungs with a wet, bubbling hitch that sounded obscenely loud in the stillness. A gurgle of mortality that marked his position like a beacon for the vultures already beginning to circle in the bleached expanse of the sky above. He knew, with the cold clarity that only comes to men who have shaken hands with death, that to remain stationary was to die, to become just another mound of refuse in the street stepping stone for the stray dogs and the drunks. And so the idea formed in the wreckage of his mind, not a thought of hope, but a commandment of pure crystallized rage that demanded motion. He extended his right arm, the fingers scraping through the dirt until they found purchase on a protruding stone, the muscles of his shoulders screaming in protest as he sought to drag the dead weight of his lower body forward, the movement tearing a fresh groan from his throat that he swallowed back down, refusing to give the hidden spectators the satisfaction of his sound. This was the crawl, a pilgrimage of inches measured in agony, a grotesque pantomime of evolution where a man was reduced to a serpent, belly to the dust, slithering through the filth of his own jurisdiction. Every inch gained was a battle won against the physics of the universe, his boots dragging uselessly behind him, leaving twin furrows in the hard-packed earth that filled instantly with the dark, rich crimson of his arterial flow, writing his sentence in the very soil he had sworn to protect. The sun, indifferent and cruel, hammered against the back of his neck, the heat waves shimmering off the ground, distorting the world into a hallucination of melting wood and liquid horizons, making the distance to the courthouse, steps a mere 30 yards away, seem like a span across a desert of fire. As he pulled himself forward, the sensory details of the street assaulted him with microscopic intensity. The iridescent carapace of a beetle navigating the valleys of a horse hoofprint, the glint of a discarded tin can reflecting the sun like a blinding star, the rhythmic thudding of his own pulse in his ears, which sounded like the march of an approaching army that would never arrive. He looked up, his neck straining against the weight of his head, and saw the storefronts of Redemption Creek looming over him, towering monoliths of gray timber that seemed to lean in, judging his weakness. their dark windows like empty eye sockets devoid of pity or soul. He saw the general store, where he had bought grain that very morning, the owner of which was undoubtedly peering through the cracks in the wall, holding his breath, praying for Elias to die quickly so that business could resume under the new lawless order. He saw the saloon, the bat-wing doors still swinging slightly from the exit of the betrayers, a pendulum counting the seconds of his suffering. The betrayal burned hotter than the lead in his gut, a searing realization that the law was not a shield held by the community, but a fragile fiction maintained by the few. And when those few bled, the community did not rush to staunch the wound, but waited to see whose boot would be on their neck next. He dragged himself another foot, the rough denim of his trousers tearing against the sharp stones of friction sending. Fresh spikes of pain shooting up his spine, but the pain was becoming distant, now a separate entity that walked beside him, a companion that whispered of the peace of letting go, simply closing his eyes and allowing the darkness to take him. But Elias Thorne did not close his eyes. Instead, he fixed them on the bottom step of the courthouse, the weathered oak plank that represented the threshold of his sanctuary and his tomb. He crawled through the shadow of the water trough, a brief respite from the sun, offering no comfort, only a chilling dampness that made his teeth chatter. The mud here slick with spilled water and slime, making his purchase difficult, his fingers slipping his face, splashing into the muck, coating his skin in a mask of primal filth. He spat the mud from his lips, a glob of black bile, and dug his nails in deeper, breaking them against the earth, finding leverage in the pain itself, using the agony as fuel to propel the engine of his ruined body. The flies had found him now, the buzzing chorus growing louder, the boldest among them landing on the back of his neck, on the wet soak of his shirt, feasting on the sweat and the blood, tiny heralds of decay that recognized the corpse before the heart had stopped beating. He swatted blindly, his coordination failing, his hands striking nothing but air, and a low, guttural laugh escaped him, a sound devoid of humor, the rattle of a man realizing the absurdity of his struggle against the inevitable. Yet he did not stop. He crawled past the barber shop, seeing the striped poles swirling in the heat haze, a dizzying spiral of red and white that mocked his vision. He crawled past the livery, smelling the sweet scent of hay and the pungent ammonia of urine, smells that reminded him of a life that felt centuries gone. The world had narrowed down to the next 6 inches, to the placement of a hand, the tightening of a bicep, the drag of a hip, the scream of nerves, the gasp for air. He was no longer Elias Thorne Marshall. He was a creature of pure will, a biological machine driving itself toward a singular coordinate. And then his fingers touched it, the rough, splintered edge of the first step. The wood was hot to the touch, almost searing, but to him, it felt like the hand of God. He gripped the edge of the stair with a strength born of desperation, his knuckles white, the veins in his forearm bulging like cords of steel beneath the dust-caked skin. He hauled his torso up, his legs trailing like dead weights, his belt buckle scraping against the wood. The elevation changed, sending a rush of dizziness through his skull that threatened to pitch him backward into the street. He hung there for a moment, suspended between the dust and the dais, a broken man draping himself over the architrave of justice, gasping, weeping. Without tears, his sweat stinging his eyes, his heart fluttering like a trapped bird against his ribs. He looked out from his slightly elevated vantage point back down the furrowed track of his own, blood that stretched across the street. A red ribbon tying him to the spot where he had fallen, and in that trail he saw the death of the man he had been. The Elias Thorne who believed in the inherent goodness of his neighbors, who believed that a badge was a symbol of mutual respect, had died back there in the dirt. The thing that was pulling itself up the stairs, step by agonizing step, dragging its broken shell toward the judge's chair that sat in the shade of the porch, was something else entirely, something forged in the kill of abandonment, tempered in the blood of betrayal, and cooled in the icy realization that in Redemption Creek there was no law but the will to survive and the capacity to inflict punishment. He reached the second step, then the third, his breathing ragged, his vision tunneling until all he could see was the empty chair waiting on the porch, throne of judgment for a kingdom of cowards. And as he finally collapsed onto the floorboards of the porch, rolling onto his back to stare up at the wooden slats of the roof that blocked the hateful sun, a shadow fell over his heart, that no light would ever pierce again. The resurrection of Elias Thorne was not a glorious ascension, accompanied by the trumpets of seraphim or the breaking of blinding light, but a jagged, tectonic shift of bone and will that occurred in the deepest recesses of a canyon where the sun only dared to visit for a fleeting hour each day, a cold and desolate womb of stone where he had dragged his shattered vessel to knit the fraying edges of his soul back together with the twine of pure, unadulterated hatred. Days bled into nights in a gray smear of fever dreams and the gnawing agony of healing, a process that felt less like recovery and more like a forging, as if the man who had crawled into that cave died within the shadows, and the thing that was preparing to leave was made of harder, darker stuff, an entity calcified by betrayal and tempered in the kill of the desert's indifference. When he finally stood, the motion was hydraulic and stiff, the sound of his joints popping echoing like gunshots in the stillness, and though his legs still carried a hitch, a permanent reminder of the fracture that had sought to anchor him to the earth, he moved with the inexorable, terrifying purpose of a glacier carving its way through a mountain range. He did not seek food to sat a hunger of the belly, for that human need had withered beneath the towering obsession that now occupied the throne of his mind, but rather he sought the tools of his new trade, scavenging the debris of the wilderness with the meticulous eyes of a vulture, picking at a carcass. He found his iron not in a gunsmith's polished case, but in the rusted remnants of a prospector, as abandoned claim a heavy single-action revolver that had been kissed by the elements until its cylinder turned, with the grinding protest of a tuned door, yet when he cleaned it with the grease of animal fat and the grit of the creek bed, it gleamed, with a dull, malevolent promise. But the gun was merely a tool for silence. The true instrument of his calling, the scepter of the hanging judge, was the rope he fashioned from the braided leather of a dead mule's harness and the fibrous strands of tough yucca, twisting them together until his fingers bled and calloused over the work, weaving a length of judgment that was heavy, stiff, and coiled like a sleeping viper at his hip. He did not ride, for a horse was a creature of blood and fear that might falter or whinny in the critical silence of the stalk, so he walked, a solitary shadow detaching itself from the canyon walls, his boots now wrapped in rags to muffle the heavy thud of his step-finding purchase on the silent stones with unnatural grace. The trail of the men who had left him for carrion was not hard to find for a man who had spent an eternity staring at the ground, for they had ridden with the arrogance of the untouchable, their hoofprints deep and careless in the hardpan, their campfires left as black scars upon the land, surrounded by the discarded bones of their gluttony and the empty bottles of their celebration. Elias followed these signs not as a tracker follows game, but as a plague follows the wind, inevitable and permeating, his senses tuned to a frequency that excluded the song of the lark or the rustle of the cottonwood, but amplified the scent of stale tobacco, the glint of brass in the dirt, and the spiritual residue of guilty men. The landscape through which he moved seemed to recognize him, the sagebrush parting before his shins without a whisper, the rattlesnakes coiling back into their dens as he passed, sensing a predator that operated outside the natural order of hunger and survival. He moved mostly by the light of a gibbous moon that hung in the sky like a hanging judge-esque coin, its pale illumination turning the desert into a monochrome theater of ghosts where every twisted mesquite tree looked like a gallows and every shadow stretched out like a grave waiting to be filled. As he closed the distance, the geography began to change, the flat scrublands rising into the jagged teeth of the blackwood, ridge a place of treacherous footing, and howling winds where the air grew thin and cold, biting at the exposed skin of his face. Yet he felt no chill, for the furnace burning within his chest was fueled by a coal that burned hotter than mere temperature could extinguish. He found their camp 3 nights into the hunt, nestled in a box canyon that offered them a false sense of security, the glow of their fire painting the canyon walls in flickering shades of orange and blood, their voices carrying on the wind, laughter crude and jagged, the sound of men who believed they had gotten away with murder and were now dividing the spoils of a life stolen. Elias stood on the rim of the canyon, looking down like a gargoyle perched upon the eaves of hell, his hand resting on the coil of rope at his belt, his eyes devoid of any spark of the man who had once believed in the written law, seeing now only the raw, unpolished truth that justice was not a decree signed by a governor, but a weight applied to a neck. He watched them for hours motionless as the stone beneath his boots cataloging their movements, learning the rhythm of their breathing the way the leader, a man named Silas, whose laugh grated like a saw on bone, tilted his head back to drink, exposing the very throat that Elias had already claimed in his mind. He did not descend immediately. The hunt was not merely about the kill, but about the imposition of terror, the tightening of the psychological noose before the physical one ever touched skin. He began his descent only when the fire had burned down to embers that stared back like dying eyes, moving down the scree slope with a silence that defied the laws of physics, a phantom drifting through the dark. He reached the perimeter of their camp and waited in the void between the firelight and the true dark close enough to smell the sour sweat of their bodies and the grease of their last meal close enough to hear the snoring of the man on watch who had succumbed to the fatal comfort of the bottle. Elias Thorne did not draw his gun. Instead, he uncoiled the rope, the leather whispering against his leg, and fashioned a loop with hands that remembered the knots of his youth, a hangman's knot with 13 turns, heavy and rigid. He was no longer Elias Thorne. The desert had scrubbed that name from the ledger of the living. He was a hanging judge, and his court was now in session, presided over by the silence of the wilderness and the cold, unblinking witness of the stars. He moved toward the sleeping sentry, not with haste, but with the terrifying fluidity of oil spilling across a floor. Stepping over the tripwire, they had lazily strung a testament to their incompetence and stood over the sleeping man, blocking out the stars, a silhouette of finality. The hunt had ended, and the judgment was about to begin, the air thickening with the pressure of impending violence. A heavy, static charge that raised the hairs on the arms of the sleeping men, a subconscious warning that the reaper had arrived not with a scythe, but with a length of braided leather and a heart turned to stone. The return of Elias Thorne to the streets of Redemption Creek did not begin with the thunder of hooves or the chaotic roar of a gunfight, but with a suffocating silence that descended upon the settlement like a heavy, wet wool blanket. A supernatural dampening of sound that strangled the crickets in the scrub brush and muted the bawdy piano music spilling from the saloon of the Gilded Lily until the only noise remaining in the universe was the rhythmic, inevitable crunch of a single pair of boots walking slowly down the center of the main thoroughfare. It was a moonless night, the sky a bruised purple expanse of nothingness that seemed to have swallowed the stars in anticipation of the atrocity to come, and under this canopy of absolute darkness, the town slept the uneasy sleep of the guilty, unaware that the scales of justice, which they had tipped so violently with their betrayal, were about to be balanced with the heavy currency of flesh and bone. Elias, or the entity that now wore the scarred and weathered skin of Elias, moved with a fluidity that betrayed no remnant of the broken man who had crawled into the canyons weeks prior. He was a monolith of darkly tanned leather and cold purpose, his duster coat whispering against his spurs, carrying in his left hand a coil of rope so thick and stiff with tallow that it looked like a dormant serpent, and in his right the heavy iron of a dragoon pistol that had been scrubbed clean of rust and anointed with oil until it gleamed like a hateful obsession. He did not go to the sheriff's office, nor did he hunt the deputies in their beds immediately, but instead walked to the town square, a patch of hard-packed dirt dominated by an ancient gnarled oak tree whose branches stretched out like the arthritic fingers of a dying giant, a tree that had seen lovers tryst and children's games, but was now consecrated for a darker purpose. With a calm that was more terrifying than any scream, Elias began his work, his movements precise and practiced as he tossed the ropes over the sturdy lower limbs of the oak, the hemp hissing through the air with the sound of a viper striking, creating 5 distinct nooses that hung in the still air, swaying slightly in a breeze that no one else could feel. 5 empty collars awaiting the necks of the men who had watched him bleed and done nothing. The first to be woken was Sheriff Miller, a man whose soul had rotted long before his body began to fail him, roused from a whiskey-induced stupor not by a shout, but by the cold metallic kiss of a gun barrel against his temple and the smell of ozone and old blood that now clung to Elias like a second skin. There were no words exchanged in that dark room, for words belonged to the living and the hopeful and Miller. Looking into the eyes of the man he had left for the vultures, saw only the abyss of his own damnation reflecting back at him, a void where mercy had been excised with surgical precision. One by one they were gathered, the sheriff, his 3 deputies who had laughed as Elias crawled, and the mayor who had signed the order of abandonment dragged from their homes in their night clothes weeping, bargaining and praying to a God who had long since turned his back on Redemption Creek, herded like cattle toward the town square, where the 5 ropes waited in the gloom like hungry mouths. The town began to wake, the shutters creaking open, as terrified citizens peered out into the darkness, their lanterns casting long trembling shadows that danced macabre waltzes on the dust, but no one dared to intervene, for the aura radiating from Elias was not that of a man but of a natural disaster, a force of retribution that could not be bargained with or stopped. He lined them up beneath the oak, their feet bare and bleeding on the stones, their hands bound behind their backs with rawhide that cut deep into the wrists. And it was then that Elias finally spoke, his voice a grinding rasp that sounded like millstones crushing grain, a sound that seemed to emanate from the earth itself rather than a human throat. He did not read them their rights. He read them their sins, reciting the precise moment of their betrayal, the weight of the silver they had taken, the specific lies. They had told his memory a perfect archive of their moral decay. He moved behind them, securing the rough, scratchy nooses around their necks, tightening the knots right behind the left ear with the intimacy of a barber, adjusting a collar, ignoring the sobbing pleas of the youngest deputy who had wet himself in terror, and the blustering threats of the mayor who still believed that his title held weight in the court of the dead. There were no trapdoors, no platforms, only the brute strength of the hanging judge and the unforgiving laws of physics. He hoisted them one by one, hauling on the other end of the ropes which he had thrown over the higher branches, pulling them into the air with a strength that belied his frame, watching as their toes scrabbled desperately for the earth that was no longer there. The sound of the strangulation was a wet, guttural symphony of gasps and the creaking of the oak branches under the sudden weight, a grotesque chorus that echoed off the wooden facades of the silent town. Elias did not look away. He did not blink. He tied off each rope to the trunk of the tree, leaving the 5 men to dance the air jig, their faces turning from red to purple to the mottled black of bruised plums, their eyes bulging as if trying to escape the pressure building within their skulls, their tongues protruding in a final mocking gesture of defiance. It was a slow death, a cruel and measured extraction of life that lasted for what felt like an eternity, the silence of the night, punctuated only by the drumming of heels against the empty air and the soft wet sounds of voiding bowels. When the last twitch had ceased and the 5 bodies hung still, rotating slowly like grotesque wind chimes in the stagnant air, Elias Thorne did not cheer or smile. He simply stood there, a sentinel of judgment, etching the image into the collective nightmare of the town. He took a piece of parchment from his coat, nailed it to the trunk of the tree with a knife driven deep into the wood, the paper fluttering slightly beneath the boots of the dead sheriff. It read simply, "Asterisk justice is the only law." Asterisk, as the first gray light of dawn began to bleed over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of slate and ash, the figure of Elias Thorne dissolved into the shadows of the canyon, leaving behind a town that would never again speak his name without a shudder, a town that would forever be marked by the 5 silhouettes hanging against the morning sun. A grim monument to the night the law returned to Redemption Creek, not to save it, but to strangle the sin out of it, one neck at a time, cementing the legend of the hanging judge who rides the border between the living and the dead, waiting for the next betrayal to summon him from the dark.